How to read imaginative literature, a subject near and dear to my own heart, as I am, in fact, both an English language and literature teacher. Imaginative literature is a broad term that encompasses books that express human experiences through fiction or poetry. But how can we read imaginative literature in a way that maximizes our enjoyment and appreciation, both of the subject and of the experience? Here's a few features, rules, and tips that I believe will help you read imaginative literature more effectively. First are some of the features and functions of imaginative literature. It's different from other types of literature, such as informative or persuasive texts, because they don't aim to convey factual information or convince us of a certain view. Instead, imaginative literature uses language creatively to evoke emotions, images, symbols, meanings, motifs that go beyond the literal sense of the words and seep into the allegorical, the metaphorical, the illusions. Imaginative literature can also challenge our assumptions, question our values, and explore alternative possibilities, realities, whole other experiences, and let you slip into the mind of a past life or a future tense. Some of the main functions of imaginative literature are to entertain. It can provide us with pleasure, amusement, and excitement, make us laugh, cry, or feel suspense, and underline some of the great stories, fables, myths, and movies that we all glean to. It can educate us about different cultures, histories, and experiences, and expose us to new ideas, concepts, and perspectives. It can inspire us to stimulate our imagination, creativity, and empathy. It can motivate us to reflect on our own lives and the actions we take. It can help us communicate, express thoughts, feelings, and the values of the authors and the characters, as well as revisit and look at our own perspectives and values. Imaginative literature can also invite us to share our own responses and interpretations with others. Books and novels, poems are famously good conversation starters and icebreakers, and it doesn't hurt to sound a little bit more well-read or well-rounded. Here's a couple general rules and suggestions for reading imaginative literature. Although there's no one right or correct way to read these works, there's a couple general suggestions I can give you that will help you get the most out of your reading experience. The first and foremost rule is just to read for your own pleasure and at your own pace. You choose books that interest you, suit your mood, and match your reading level. You don't have to force yourself to finish a book or to read it in an allotted amount of time. There's no grade point coming. There's no end date or due date. Read at your leisure. Pick up one book here, another there. Maybe you have a Tuesday morning book and a Wednesday night book. Just read something you don't like or don't understand on occasion so that you still challenge yourself. And read with your own imagination. Try and visualize scenes and characters in the book to hear their voices come to life. Immerse yourself in the fictional world and suspend your disbelief. Don't be afraid to come to terms with the character or to fill in the gaps or imagine alternative scenarios of your own. Don't judge with your everyday or normal existence. Try and actually feel what the other character would have felt in their time, their place, their skin, and their clothes. When you appreciate the artistic qualities of the book, now we're getting into the aesthetics. We're talking about the language, the style, the structure, and symbolism. This is why we read something like Ulysses, not for the day-to-day of Stephen Dedalus, but because we're curious how the author, James Joyce, plays with words, shapes them into sounds and places and scenes that come to life. And we get to recognize the author's craft and intention, to see the beauty of Virginia Woolf or the sharp jabs of a poet like Anne Sexton. You don't judge a book by its cover or genre, and you don't judge an author like Margaret Atwood by a single book or word or sentence, but by her entire oeuvre. The poems from the 60s come in and juxtapose against the novels from the 80s or the 2000s, and you get this broad picture of her writing life. Read with curiosity. Be curious about the book and its context. Ask about the plot, the characters, themes, and messages. Question the author's intentions. Research the background information. Use a contextual lens to get into the author's own biography, historical setting, the literary influences, break through the spine of the book, find out what was happening in those days. Don't take everything at face value or accept a single interpretation, and read with openness. If you come to the text with open-mindedness and respect, you'll consider these different views and perspectives and may take some of them on for your own, or acknowledge the bias and prejudice at least. Just don't dismiss or criticize a book based on your personal preference or time. So a couple specific rules or tips, such as for novels versus short stories, plays, poems, etc. So for the different medium or the different type of book you're going to be reading. Novel's a quite long work of fiction, and it usually has a fairly complex plot, multiple characters, times, various settings. So when you're reading a novel, you want to pay attention to specific elements. In plot, you're going to think about the sequence of events that make up the story, usually consisting of exposition or an introduction, the rising action or the sort of complications and struggles of the characters, the climax, which is the turning point, the big shift in the story, and then the falling action towards a resolution, which, of course, in some cases, like tragedy, will be death, and in others, could be a denouement or a conclusion that fades to black. The characters, the key, of course. These are the people who participate in the story, possibly animals, anthropomorphic characters. They usually have different personalities, motivations, relationships, and roles. Analyze how they're described, developed, or changed by authors through the course of the plot. What's the arc that they follow? The change, the transformation. The setting is the time and place where the story takes place. It can also include the social, cultural, historical, or political context. What is the climate these words are coming to you from? Try to understand how the setting influences the plot and the characters. The theme is the main idea or message of a novel. It's what the author wants to convey through the story. So classically, The Death of the Salesman or Gatsby are about the American dream and its failure to live up the potential of an idyllic or utopian world. And this theme can be expressed explicitly or implicitly through various symbols and motifs. And you're going to need to try to infer what the author is saying about life. Next up, we're going to talk about a couple specifics for the short story. So a short story is a work of fiction that usually focuses on a single event, character, or a theme stuck in time. When reading a short story, we want to pay attention to the following elements. The plot, and it's usually going to be more simple and straightforward. A single line, often no subplots, just one straightforward event, a shift, a twinge, a tweak, a beginning, a middle, and an end. You should be able to summarize this in a sentence for most stories. The characters of stories are usually fewer. They're limited in size, but not necessarily scope. So a good short story, like something from Chekhov, is going to have depth, or like Laurie Moore, who just in a few words can capture the essence of a character and a person. They often represent a certain type or archetype. They also tend to have little or no background development. Stories often have a cold start, like a cold opening it's called, which is like in media res. The characters are in the middle of things already, right? They're already at the funeral. We don't get to watch the whole life. They're at the funeral and they're living through the past of a great person or a parted loved one. Like there's a classic Salinger story where they do this. The theme of a short story is usually very clear and very focused. It often revolves around a single idea or issue the author wants to explore or illustrate, and it tends to have a strong impact or resonance. There's a lot of punchy effect here. Like straight through the jugular is the way I think of with a good short story. It comes at you and grabs you by the throat. So try to state that theme in one word or phrase. Now, next up, we're going to talk about plays and theatrical plays, we're saying. And this is another work of fiction, but it's meant to be performed. So just the idea of reading these as a novel or a text is different. You're going to want to read it out loud. If you are reading a play silently by yourself and not with other actors or people and doing a read aloud, you're going to want to make sure you've actually seen a performance. You should pay attention to the following elements: the dialogue, the spoken words, what it reveals about thoughts, feelings, intentions, actions, backgrounds, accents. This can convey tone, mood, the style, the setting. Try to tweak your ear and listen for the rhythm of how a certain character speaks. Listen to how it flows and varies. Look at the stage directions. Here you're going to find out, is the playwright controlling, intense, directive? Are Are they trying to set the stage precisely and exactly? Or are they hoping to create an interpretive text that you can read and see how you fit? Some stage directions might have an entire house plotted and mapped out, like Death of a Salesman. In others, like an Ionesco play, it might literally just be a chair on stage. They could indicate the props, costume, lights, sounds, and special effects. Try to imagine how these directions would look or feel to you on the stage. The scenes are the units of actions. These are little chunks in a play, almost like chapters in a book, or exactly akin to scenes in a movie or television show. They change the time, place, or situation, and they usually have a clear purpose or structure to them. And similar to the short story and novel, the play will have a theme, and this is the main idea that's being conveyed throughout the play. Try to infer what the author is saying. Plays tend to have a strong message. Other than the absurd, they tend to be more moral, specific lessons about a time and a place. And I think it's because they want to leave that intense emotional effect on the viewer in the moment, right? A play is much more written for the present tense, whatever that tense was, whatever the context of when it was first staged. It's so relevant to a time. Whereas a novel, short story can kind of be taken out of time, especially if certain elements are left out. Finally, poems. This is a work of fiction that uses rhythmic and artistic language. Lines, stanzas, rhyme, meter, imagery, all of that specific language we talk about when we analyze poems. You should pay attention to the following elements: how the line breaks fall, how long are the lines, a certain length, shape, and structure of the line, the certain meaning, sound, and effect. Try to read each line aloud and notice how it looks, sounds, and rolls off your tongue. The stanzas are the grouping of lines, little blocks or chunks of text, and they also have a certain pattern, order, number, and this functions and controls the theme and the mood that the poet wants to convey. Compare and contrast different stanzas and how they relate to each other. Rhyme. This is the repetition of similar sounds at the end of words or lines, and it usually creates a musical effect. It's also a memorization tool. So you think of little children's songs, the Itsy Bitsy Spider. It helps kids memorize things, both words and vocabulary. It also follows a certain scheme or pattern. So Shakespeare and the iambic pentameter, which doesn't matter what that is unless you're interested in it. But identify this rhyme scheme and how it affects the meaning and tone of the poem and how it reads aloud. The meter is the rhythm or beat. This is the stressed versus unstressed syllables. And you're going to hear this. Bring up any spoken word poet on YouTube or even a comedian, and you're really going to hear the meter of their speech. Certainly a political speech as well would have this. Scan each line for the meter and how it affects the flow and expression of the poem. And finally, think about the imagery, the figurative language. What do you see? What's the sensory impression in the reader's mind? Are there metaphors, similes, personification, symbols? What do these convey through emotion and meaning? Try to visualize this imagery and how it enhances the theme and the message of the poem. I always think of Atwood's Morning in the Burned House here, and visualizing this woman sitting at an empty table with the whole house burned down around her, almost like that famous Buster Keaton image of the house frame falling down on top of a man who's standing there. I picture her like that. Reading imaginative literature can be an enjoyable and rewarding experience. It's going to build your imagination, your hope, and your empathy. But you need to be more open-minded and respectful when interacting with others and consider their different points of view and perspective, regardless of age, race, sex, gender, or the time when they were alive. It's going to help us acknowledge our own bias and prejudice. Comment below. Next video up in the playlist is going to be how to read history.